forward to hopefully getting some questions for you all at the end. Okey-dokey. Okay, so hello from Xishuangbannna Tropical Botanical Garden. Yadvinda did a fantastic job at pronouncing the name of an almost unpronounceable place, so it's great to be talking to all of you. So first of all, we need to realize that there is a real need for global tropical conservation science. We are now in 2021, and as of last year, we should have had a new global biodiversity framework to take us up to 2050 with more ambitious and implementable biodiversity goals. And as we will see more at the end, we didn't get there, in part because we are not very good environmental stewards. After a decade of global biodiversity, not a single Aichi target has actually been reached. The closest that we've come is target 11, where we almost got to the protected area coverage we were aiming for, but we failed every single time. Thinking about a global biodiversity framework that could actually help us bend the curve on global biodiversity loss, we need to think very carefully about why we failed, what we need in order to develop effective targets, and how we can actually implement them. And from personally following the various drafts of the Global Biodiversity Framework, I'm certainly not convinced that we're going in the right direction. And what we're going to talk about today is one of the things that seems to be entirely missing from that framework, but is critical to global biodiversity retention. Global biodiversity dialogues seem overwhelmingly targeted on a small number of species. And for any of you who attended the One Planet Summit earlier this week, you would have heard a huge focus on the African continent. The only mention I heard of Asia was when there was the mention of the COP in Kunming. And we seem to conflate climate targets with sustainability, which of course everyone listening today knows that the two are not the same thing. And though we need to make sure we minimize climate change to maintain global biodiversity, simple climate targets that don't factor in biodiversity may actually have harmful impacts on biodiversity retention. And we seem to have an incomplete disconnect on what is threatened, why it is threatened, and how we can actually develop more effective targets. So the key to stemming this global biodiversity loss is identifying why we are losing species. Of course, this includes direct loss of habitats, as well as the exploitation of individual species. And this is something that hasn't actually been as well factored into the targets as one would think, given that it's fairly obvious. And successful conservation, as many of you listening today will realize, needs to actually work within the bounds of modern societies. If we purely have theoretical approaches, often they do not work in regional contexts. And we need to make sure that we have regional stakeholders in order to make sure that we have scalable, workable, and implementable targets. And another thing that the Global Biodiversity Framework lacked is any mechanism to actually implementing those targets or making certain bodies responsible for their implementation. Our understanding of these threats is also often relatively limited, and we still seem very biased towards select targets and species. When we're talking about global biodiversity loss and habitat health, and here you'll see a figure of something we're working on now on updating the global human footprint analysis and making it representative of a wider suite of threats, including some which have traditionally been overlooked, such as mining, damming, and other threats, which actually can have a huge impact on ecosystems that may otherwise seem intact and can lead to cascades of other impacts. With regards to land cover, we do seem to be making at least some progress in terms of these global biodiversity targets, but direct utilization of species seems to be much more overlooked. And it's actually much more extensive and having a much greater impact than might otherwise be realized. The first thing to realize is not all wildlife trade is illegal. Often when we talk about wildlife trade, the first thing we think of is the illegal wildlife trade. And if you look it up online, here's the illegal wildlife trade, and you initially see lots of tigers. You see pangolins, the most trafficked mammal on the planet. You won't see the European eel, which is actually the most trafficked vertebrate on the planet, because we don't tend to be good at thinking about things like fish. And of course, if you look at this suite of species, you'll see we have one early primate, the loris there. We have multiple images of pangolins, rhinos, and tigers. We don't have any non-mammals. If we try and look up legal wildlife trade, you can see that almost everything on the screen here from a simple search isn't telling me about legal wildlife trade, which was my search term, it's telling me about illegal trade. Because almost every time we think about sustainable utilization or how animals are being used, we are thinking about illegal trade. And you can see there's only one entry on that screen, which is on the actual search term, on the legal wildlife trade. And of course, if we're thinking about the legal wildlife and the illegal wildlife trade, traffic is the major monitoring network, though it only provides information for a subset of species which are listed by CITES. Now, CITES is, of course, the global body to actually monitor the international trade of endangered species. Now, even though it has endangered species in the name, it is only a subset of endangered species which is seen to be at threat from global trade and in which there is enough of a demand to require global regulation. As we will come to see later, that does not provide an overarching framework that is inclusive enough for the degree of wildlife trade that is occurring in 2020. So CITES initially entered into force in 1975, and since then meetings have occurred about every 3 years, with reviews of the species list and meetings of the standing committee occurring in between them. And at present, there are over 182 member countries, and the European Union implements CITES on a regional basis. But if we look at how CITES is actually broadcasting itself, the species that seem to be prioritized, despite the fact that even though you don't see a single plant species in this image, a huge majority of the species covered by CITES are actually orchids, because very early on in the CITES implementation, it was realized that the demand for orchids was already likely to be unsustainable if it wasn't regulated on a global basis. As I'll come to later, that doesn't mean it's effective. I and others here will think that it's actually not very effective, but you can see already that almost every species being highlighted in this 40-year review of CITES is a mammal. In fact, there are only 2 species on this screen that are not mammals. And yet, if we are to look at any list in the world of endangered species, mammals are unlikely to be the top of that list. And even if we were to look at a list of endangered mammals, you'd see the number of CITES listed bats, for example, is not going to be very high. Now, the need for CITES listing bats is going to be very variable. There is regional trade, but it shows that actually the name of endangered species may not be the most appropriate given its role in monitoring trade today. And this is looking at the membership list. So you can see the majority of countries globally are now CITES members. Those gray countries are the only non-member countries that are not signatories. And you can see the vast majority are island states. Most mainland continental islands are all CITES members. So as I've said, not all wildlife trade is illegal. If it is not illegal, and of course, only a very small proportion of illegal trade is actually monitored by CITES. And the legal trade is actually valued at about $100 billion euros annually in the EU alone, and up to about $400 billion on a global basis, relative to the illegal trade, which is only about 23 billion annually. So even though these global discussions about the impact of illegal wildlife trade, actually legal wildlife trade is far more valuable. And also, as we'll come on to later, despite the economic implications of both legal and illegal trade, CITES is vastly underfunded. So if we're thinking about what that legal wildlife trade is made up of, about $200 billion is for fish, a little over $200 billion is for timber, another 2.5 is for fashion of reptile and amphibian leather, and then there's the pet trade. And we're pretty good at forgetting about the pet trade. Now, if we were to think about fish, it isn't sustainable. As I will come on to later, if we continue to consume seafood at the current rates, the expectation is we will run out of seafood by 2048. And you can see already that even the aquacultural trade, blue there is domestic, whereas gray is international. So most countries are producing seafood for themselves. But you can see that almost all of that seafood is not coming from aquaculture. And even when it does, it is reliant on basically fish meal from the ocean. And if we were to think about timber trade, And here is the global map of what drives deforestation, courtesy of Global Forest Watch. Those red areas are for commodity-driven deforestation. In places like Southeast Asia, that's mainly for rubber and palm oil. So that timber, even if it is in a plantation, may be causing forest loss. So when we think about wildlife trade, even legal wildlife trade is having a huge impact on biodiversity. And much of this is not sustainable and lacks any sustainable baseline. Now, as I've said, we have figures for global timber trade. We have figures for global fish trade. We don't have figures for global pet trade. So let's think a little bit about the global pet trade. Now, many of you will have had pet birds, pet fish, pet amphibians. The two photos in the bottom are actually me with my corn snake, age 8 and 28. So as a child, I had pet reptiles. In fact, pet reptiles are actually more popular than dogs in the UK. And most of us would never think that some of those animals will be coming from the wild, and it may be having an impact on the long-term health and viability of those species. In terms of bird trade, and I will be talking more about trade bans later, I know that there will be very mixed feelings on trade bans. It's estimated that the impact of the European bird ban on the EU actually caused a 90% drop in the global trade of birds. And yet regional trade within Europe remained consistent because it was replaced, those wild caught birds were actually replaced by captive bred birds. And the US already had it in the US Bird Act. So even though birds have some level of protection, almost every other group that is being exploited for the pet trade lacks that same level of regulation. On a global basis, the aquaria trade, and I'll mention this briefly later, over 2,300 species are in the US alone. And whereas freshwater fish are largely bred in captivity, most of the saltwater fish you see in aquaria will come from the wild. And again, we do not know the long-term impacts of that trade, and there is very little monitoring. Reptiles are very popular pets. As you can see at the bottom, and as I said earlier, I had multiple reptiles myself as a child, and it was not unusual. But only 9% of reptile species have any level of CITES regulation. And up until now, we had no idea what proportion of species were actually in trade and how many of those might be coming from the wild. And as I said a few moments ago, there may actually be more reptiles in the UK as pets than dogs. So this is not a small niche market. We are talking about millions of individuals of an unknown number of species. So unfortunately, if you are buying a reptile, there is no legal mandate to say where it's come from, whether it's captive bred or if it's from the wild. If you're a reptile breeder, this is particularly important because, of course, if it comes from the wild, it could actually bring diseases or parasites to your stock. So we looked at 3 different data sets. We used the CITES database, which you'll see in pretty much every global analysis of wildlife trade, as well as the LEMIS database, which monitors the importation and the exportation of wildlife to and from the US. And we also scraped 151 websites, which totaled just under 24,000 web pages of reptiles for sale. Online analysis, we used a number of keywords to actually identify the web pages, and then we scraped them using both common and Latin names, and then had a synonym list to resolve species. And as I will say more on later, both for reptiles and amphibians, there are a huge number of synonyms. And so if you use raw data, you may often overinflate the number of species because there hasn't been good standardization. For one website, we also looked at long-term trends. So we could look at differences in trades between 2004 and 2019 to see how trade was changing in terms of the diversity. So in total, we found just under 4,000 species of reptiles. That's about 36% of all reptile species were in trade. Now remember, I said at the beginning, 9% have any CITES level of regulation. And yet 36% of species are in trade. If we look at the number of endangered and critically endangered species, you can see we had 124 species that were critically endangered that were in trade, and a further 190 species which were endangered. So we can see very clearly that endangered species are being targeted. And yet you can see that within each of these three data sets, we have at least some unique species which are not found in the other. We also included, and I'll say more on that later, 5 different languages. So we could see if different countries and different languages also had different markets. But you can see we had an absolutely enormous number of species that were coming in trade. And in the online trade, which is exclusively for pets, just under 3,000 species of reptiles are entering into trade. Now, it doesn't mean much if we say this number of species is in trade, unless we also look to see what proportion of these are coming from the wild. Bear in mind that reptiles are not a well-studied group. In fact, the most well-funded group in the world in terms of funding availability are elephants, and the elephant species actually have more funding for research than all reptile species combined in some analysis that is currently being conducted by a colleague of mine. So these species are vastly understudied. This means that for the majority of them, there is no population assessment. There is not a good idea of the range of the species. And so even though the expert group has tried to map out the majority of species, there is going to be a degree of error. And we have no idea of if these populations are decreasing in the majority of cases. And yet almost 4,000 of them are in trade. If we look at the statistics, as I said, 36% are in trade. Online sales includes just under 3,000 species, which is about 25% of all known reptile species, and 76% have no CITES level regulation. So the majority of these species can be freely and legally traded, and there is no overarching regulation to control that. Lemmus is similar. So again, there's about 76% where there is no CITES level regulation, and the CITES database, of course, 88% of those species are actually CITES regulated. The rest come from seizures, but seizures only accounted for 0.01% of all trades. So it's a tiny percentage, and it also did not account for very many species. So CITES is not representative. This is not too surprising, but it does underscore that the vast majority of studies that have looked at global wildlife trade using CITES data are missing out on the vast majority of species that are actually being traded. And it is also important to note that 99.99% of these were being legally traded. So this is the legal wildlife trade, but it is having an undeniable impact on native populations, as I'll come on to in a moment. I'm just going to move this from the top, or try to. Okay. If we look at the trends over time, you can see that whereas the CITES trade is remaining fairly stable at just under 500 species every year, the online trade increases initially up to about 2009, and then it fluctuates, whereas the Lemmus trade continues to increase. So overall, we are seeing a slight increase in trade, and unsurprisingly, we see CITES is missing the majority of species every single year. So new species also appeared every year. Most years had species that were only being sold that year and not in any other year. And CITES is monitoring under a quarter of species that are in trade in any given year. So they're only capturing a small proportion of all of the species in trade. And given that there is turnover every year in the online trade and the Lemmus trade, that means that they are missing the vast majority of species being traded. Also, it can be very difficult to actually monitor exactly what is being traded. Both for CITES and Lemmus, often only the genus and sometimes only the family will be given. Whilst we could not analyze that data because we were looking at species-specific data, it means species-level impacts can be very hard to calculate because you often can't see how many individuals or even how many species, if you have multiple species that could be traded within a genus, are actually going into trade. It's also often cited that people are motivated by novelty. And there are jokes about when new species are discovered in Myanmar, then it's not very long before people are going from Germany to go and export those species. I bring up Germany in particular because it is home to the largest reptile markets in the world. And we actually found 133 species described since 2000 and already in trade within the study, including a number that were in trade within the same year that they were studied. Other studies have already shown that up to 21 species of reptile have had their entire wild population collected out, probably for the pet trade. And I personally have contacts who will no longer provide the location of newly described species because a species that they described in the past was within weeks of the publication of its description already collected almost to extinction. Because we know that collectors are looking for these descriptions, particularly for certain very attractive groups like some of the cave geckos, and using that to identify new species for trade. In fact, 9 species appeared in trade in the year they were described. So yes, this trade is motivated by novelty. We already knew that anecdotally, but this data really shows that people are going for the new species. In addition, because of the way CITES is structured, if you look at these online fora, you will often see discussion in the run-up to a CITES meeting when, for example, the earless monitor lizard in Borneo, before the CITES meeting was due to be, there were discussions saying, the trade of this will probably be monitored by CITES soon. We need to collect as many as we can now, because otherwise it will be difficult or illegal to export. Now, the earless monitor is a unique species. It's difficult to disguise as another species in exports, and it's easy for people to recognize. So in that case, it just spurred people to collect more whilst it was legal before it became difficult. For many species, they are harder to recognize. And so even if they are protected, there are other ways to export them just by using, for example, a false name. If we want to have a look at where these species are coming from, the short answer is these animals are coming from everywhere. You can see that in many of these places, and I'm going to move this again if I'm able to. Just trying to move the bar here. There can be up to thousands of species in trade in some of these areas. And no, it doesn't actually go up to that. We just set that as the maximum. And if we look at the percentage of species in trade, we see that whereas the pauperate areas see 100% of their species in trade somewhere, even the most diverse parts of the planet, such as the Amazon and Papua New Guinea, have at least half of their species in trade. That means almost anywhere you go, half of the native reptiles there are going to be traded legally somewhere in the world, which is a frightening concept given that this is the largest terrestrial vertebrate group on Earth, and there are currently more classified reptiles than there are birds. So the fact that almost everywhere in the planet, more species are in trade than not in trade should be an alarm bell in terms of actually thinking about how sustainable this is. So how are these 3 different data sets going? I've already said that CITES only captures a small portion of species in trade. And again, here, if you look at that map of what species are listed by CITES or in trade, you can see the whole thing is washed out. Whereas both the online trade and the LEMIS trade emphasize the high levels of trade across the tropics. And you cannot really even see those patterns from the CITES map because they do not serve to protect species, particularly in the most diverse countries in the world, which may be less likely to uplist some of the species. And for those of you who are interested in this little gecko in the corner, of course, this species is highly in demand in trade because it looks cool. It's a demonic leaf-tailed gecko. Even the name would make people want to buy it, and yes, they are threatened by trade. So as I said, CITES massively underestimates the amount of trade, and the maximum number of species per unit area is less than half of that of any of the other data sets. So it very clearly underrepresents how species are threatened. So is it actually really having an impact? I've talked about where these species theoretically come from, but if they're bred in captivity, it's not an issue. As I said, we're looking at a huge number of species. Just from the online trade, it's almost 25%. That is only from the 1 year shot. So that was before we then added another decade of data, which is why the other percentage is slightly higher. There are actually more non-CITES listed species that are listed in the CITES portal that are not in trade, because some species, of course, have 0 quotas, so they cannot be traded even though they're listed by CITES. 10% of species within the online trade are critically endangered or they're data deficient. So we have not even enough data to actually make an assessment of how endangered they are. Within LEMIS, 44% of species don't have an IUCN assessment. 2% are data deficient. So basically 46% of species that are legally traded into the US through LEMIS don't have an actual assessment behind them. And 20% of species in CITES have no IUCN status. So these are probably, well, these species are being legally traded. They've probably been seized in those cases because they don't have the right documentation. And as I said, overall 79% of all species that are in trade are not listed by CITES. So they're being legally traded with no global level regulations. If we look at where we see threatened species, so here is a map of the near threatened species in trade, the vulnerable species, so you start to see the tropics coming through with a special focus on Southeast Asia as having a greater proportion of its most vulnerable species in trade. If we look at endangered species, Vietnam pops right out. Now, many of these are karst endemic species, so Certodactylus, Probligoniasaurus species. Many of them are very, very range limited, and you can see a huge number of them are in trade. Now, Vietnam doesn't actually have very many of its reptile species CITES listed, so the likelihood of these being unsustainably exported is very high. If we look at critically endangered species, once again, Southeast Asia is the global hotspot for critically endangered species that are in trade. And if we then look on a national level basis to see what proportion of species per country are in trade, so the species in trade are in blue. If they're, the species in the country, if they are not traded, are in blue. If they are in red, it means that they are in trade, but there is no regulation behind them. If we just look at the species that are being traded, the species in blue here are those that have CITES regulations, and those in red are the ones that lack CITES regulations. So species that can be legally traded and are not covered by CITES, and they're in trade. You can see that all over the world, the only 2 countries where the majority of species that are in trade have CITES regulations are Madagascar and New Zealand. For every other country in the world, the majority of species that are in trade have no CITES level regulation. If we were to look at the number of species in trade based on their endangered status, you can see that for the majority of countries, in most places, the majority of species are least concern. But there are 2 very interesting patterns here. For the African continent, the majority of species in trade have not been assessed. That means we don't even have the basic data to map out where these species are. We have no data on their populations, and yet they're in trade. If we were to look at the American continent, you can see that in many tropical areas, about half the species in trade have no assessment. And if we look at Southeast Asia, we can see that the majority of species either have no assessment or they're endangered. And so no matter where you go, in all tropical areas that are centers of biodiversity, the majority of species in trade do not have the data to be sustainably collected from the wild and exported. But do these species come from the wild? So then we had to look. We could not identify for the online trade if they were captive bred or if they were from the wild, because that data doesn't exist and people do not legally need to make that data available. But from the LEMIS data and from the CITES data, the percentages were very consistent. So in CITES, in terms of individuals, about 43% of individuals were wild caught, whereas in LEMIS, there were 92% of species, which had at least some individuals from the wild, and it was about 44% of all individuals. But that, as I'll show in a minute, is when we include things like the fashion trade. including millions of individual crocodiles that are used for reptile leather, as well as pythons. And for some groups, it is a considerably higher percentage of individuals that are coming from the captive trade. The online species are also likely to show a similar pattern. So we are looking at 92% of species that have at least some individuals in trade, and on average, half individuals almost are coming from the wild. And as we've already seen, many of these species lack the data to even have any population assessment or even to give them an IUCN listing. Many of the species that are particularly targeted, including Goniosaurus and Certodactylus, which are two groups of cave lizards, have very small ranges. Many of them are endemic to a single hill. So these species can't even be mapped on these global maps because their ranges may only be a few kilometers, and yet they are very much at risk from trade. And we know that they are entering it from the wild. If we look to see the rate of species descriptions over time, this has a dot for the number of species described each year. And you can see that actually in recent years, we've described a huge number of reptiles. But if we look on average, it's showing a very different pattern. And as we move towards today, the average range size has dropped dramatically. So those new species that are appearing in trade, often within the first year of description, are very likely to be very range limited species, which will be disproportionately impacted from trade based on wild sourced individuals. When we look at different languages, so almost 40% of species were only actually being traded in one language. If you go to a different country with a different language, the demands are different. Japan, for example, had a particularly interesting profile with species and genera that were not being sampled elsewhere. So English sites, there were most of the pages were either in English or German. Those were the two biggest markets that we could access. But Japan had some unusual ones. And as I'll talk about very briefly in a minute, the amphibian trade, we've added an additional language, and we're also using Portuguese now. When we use rarefactions, we have well over 40% of reptile species already appearing in trade. And if we look at the language markets, you can see, unsurprisingly, German has a lot because of the huge reptile fairs in Han, followed by English, French, Japanese, and then Spanish. Now, if we look at the percentage of individuals coming from the wild, again, we see a very interesting pattern. Dark red here indicates the percentage of species individuals coming from the wild. Unsurprisingly, from the amphibians and the tuatara, which is the rhynchocephala here, 100% of species and individuals are coming from the wild. But there are not huge amounts in trade. In fact, there are only two tuatara and 400 amphibians. But if we look at the over 16 million lizards, almost 75% of individuals were coming from the wild. Almost 75% of individuals of species that are frequently range limited. And the only group which, at least in theory, has the majority of individuals coming from captivity or ranching are the crocodiles. And if you talk to experts, this is actually a much grayer area than you might imagine. So, most legally traded species for things like crocodile are in much higher volumes. To a lesser extent, tortoises are still used in the fashion trade. The cost of regulating other species is, of course, something that has stopped them from actually being uplisted. When you suggest that large numbers of species are uplisted together into CITES, normally cost will be stated as the reason for not uplisting them. And the status quo until today has been that until it is listed on CITES, it can be legally traded globally based on national level regulations. So if your country doesn't have regulations, it's very easy to export. Most countries have at least some regulations now, but they can be very permissive in terms of what and how things are exported. So CITES is undoubtedly failing species that are at risk from the pet trade. We've seen that for things like the lizards, almost 75% of individuals are coming from the wild, and that includes critically endangered and newly described species, which can be legally traded from the moment that they're discovered. even though we know that many of these species are likely to only exist on a single hill. And that's why we continue to see articles like this, species that have been newly described or are known to be endangered, but for which there is no regulation to control their trade. If you look at something like this, so this is the New Caledonian mossy or giant gecko, there are two populations. The population on this island is maybe different enough to be considered a separate species. When it is sold based on the island name because there is separate demand for it. If it is classified separately, it will be critically endangered. And yet it is legally in trade and it is not CITES listed. For the Certodactylus lizards, about 50% of the 40 species in trade have an IUCN listing. The other 20 species are not listed by the IUCN. They are likely to be critically endangered or endangered because of most of them will only live in a very small area. Boniosaurus, and you can see these are stunningly beautiful lizards, even if the thing is partly occluded. There is a huge demand for these species in trade. There are 15 species that are currently in trade, but all of them are either highly endangered or they haven't been assessed. And until about 2 months ago, none of them was CITES listed. Following the publication of our paper, Japan has actually uplisted 6 of these species. But as I'll say more on later, having an approach where we are always catching up with species that are already vulnerable is not an effective safety net for the biodiversity for the majority of species. And as I said earlier, 21 species are known to have had their entire wild populations collected for the pet trade. And those are only the ones that we are aware of. Many sites do not get regularly monitored. And so it's likely that many of these get noticed by the person who described them when someone reports that the species is in trade. And the majority of the time, they are not going to be monitoring that site or websites. And so their extinction in the wild may go unknown. But is this really a unique problem for reptiles, or is this a symptom of a more epidemic problem for other species that might be exploited by the pet trade? So this is something we're working on now. Something I'm not showing today that we are also working on is looking at motivations for trade. As I said before, the reptiles are exported not only for pets, but also for things like leather and to a smaller degree to produce antivenom. For the amphibians, they are also used for amphibian leather. It's used in the fashion trade, but more often they are used for the medical and pharmaceutical trade. And there is actually a huge demand for amphibian meat. Frogs' legs are predominantly being sourced from China and Indonesia and being exported around the world in huge quantities, together with, of course, chytrid fungus, which has its own problems. If we look at just those 3 databases we looked at before, so the CITES trade, the online trade, and LEMIS, we see just over 900 species in trade. We've actually broadened this to include a number of other databases, and that takes us to about 1,300 species of amphibians in trade, which is around 17% of species. So this is not an inconsiderable number of species being impacted by trade. If we look at where they're coming from, again, they show a very similar pattern to that of the reptiles, with the majority of species coming from the global tropics. If we look at the percentages, once again, we find that most places have at least half their amphibian species in trade. And if we look at those 3 databases, CITES is failing even worse. It seems to miss most of the areas that amphibians are being traded. Now, this would not be a problem if they were being sustainably traded. It wouldn't be a problem if we didn't know that these are endangered species coming from the wild in numbers that we do not know, because it is impossible to quantify the trade in these species, as I will say more of later, because at the moment, especially for the amphibians, there is no database like the World Customs Union does not even provide a weight for the amount of imported amphibians, though amphibian legs in some sites are being monitored, but not live amphibians. If we look at the endangered species, the good news is that there are over 7,000 species that may not be traded. If we are just looking at those 3 databases, it's slightly less. It's still around the 7,000 mark if we don't include the other databases. And there's about 900 species in trade. But you can see that 160 of those are already threatened, and that does increase when we use things like CITES level data. If we look at critically endangered and endangered species, and I acknowledge it is hard to see these, many amphibian species are very range limited. Many of them will occur in a single water basin. Again, if we look at the vulnerable and near threatened species, you can see an interesting pattern there, but parts of the tropics are starting to come up. And if we look at small range species, you can see these dark shadowy spots that did not appear in the other maps. These are range limited species that are in trade. Now, it's important to note that especially in areas like Southeast Asia, many very range limited amphibians are for some unknown reason not classified as threatened. We know that these species have permeable skin, so they're likely to be very sensitive to pollutants, and this region is not pollution free. So the justification for why these species are not considered threatened is something that I have not managed to find, but you can see that there are a large number of these very range limited species in places like Madagascar and across other parts of the tropics. And these are species that are in trade, despite the fact that if they are coming from the wild, which is likely, then it is undoubtedly going to be causing a huge impact on those populations. And 42% of individuals do come from the wild. And again, 99.9% is legal. So these 160 almost species that are threatened and in trade are likely to be coming from the wild. And again, it's going to be having a huge impact on the future survival of these species. And no country has the majority of its species protected. Whereas Madagascar and New Zealand were doing really well for the amphibians, probably because everyone knows about New Zealand's very charismatic gecko species, they're not doing so well for their amphibian species. And there is not a single country that protects the majority of its amphibians in trade. Again, if we look at the trends of species in trade over time, you can see that particularly in Lemmus, the number of species has continued to climb, whereas the online trade has varied. And once again, CITES captures only a tiny portion of the species in trade. If we look at them in terms of the species appearing in trade that have been described since 2000, we can see that there's about 36 species described since 2000 that are already in trade. Fewer species have been described than the reptile species, so this is still a considerable proportion. And you can see the majority of these species are NA, because IUCN has not actually given them an assessment yet, but a number of them are critically endangered or endangered. So this is undoubtedly having an impact, and you can see that many of them are actually in trade within a year or 2 years of description. So these are species which we know must be rare because many of them haven't been described or cited before, and they're likely to be range limited, and yet they enter trade very fast. But how about non-vertebrates? Is this just a vertebrate problem and we don't need to think more broadly about other species that might be impacted? So as I've said, up to about 75% of lizards were in trade from the wild. Many of these species are coming within years of their description. So 39 amphibian species, 135 or so reptiles. And hotspots are largely in Southeast Asia, though to some extent other parts of the tropics, which are the least likely to be uplisting these species to CITES, especially if it's likely to be in low numbers, and so it's not going to be seen as profitable or a sustained market. And this is something we really need to think very carefully about. The fact that it doesn't seem to be a continuous or a sustained market does not mean that exports of thousands or sometimes millions of individuals is not going to have an impact on the long-term survival of these species. For the reptiles, only Madagascar and New Zealand actually gave adequate protection to the majority of species, and for both groups, 99.9% was legal. So for these groups, we obviously need to tighten regulations. We can't continue to make it legal to be trading a species from the wild the year it was described. But we also need to think about other groups. So this is some very preliminary analysis, but we will be using some similar approaches to those I've shown for the other groups. But if we're to look at arachnids, and we're going to include further languages for this because Now that we have an approach, we've been trying to consult to try and understand which languages these species might be traded in. But we can see that if we look, and now I have to look at the column that isn't showing. So if we look at CITES, almost 100% of the species that are in CITES have an appendix. But if we look at the species in Lemis, because we haven't looked at the online trade yet, you can see that captive bred, 17% have an appendix, wild caught, 9% have an appendix, and other, so it could be ranched or something, or someone could just be stating something which isn't necessarily verified, is about 33% have an appendix. So the majority of these individuals in trade, and you can see the numbers here. These are not small numbers. You are talking about literally hundreds of thousands of individuals being exported from the wild. Now, this is only for the case of Lemis into the US market. With these species being imported, it is undeniably having a large impact on their wild populations, especially as many of these species probably haven't been well described. Now, some arachnids are lucky. They are listed at a very high level, which means when new species are described, they are instantly given CITES coverage because they fall within a family that has already been listed. But we are still seeing the vast majority of species and individuals which have no basic protection. If we look to these other groups over time, we can see that levels of birds have been particularly high, though many of those are going to be coming from captivity, but we have seen sustained trade in numerous different groups over time. And if we were to look at the Lemis data, you can see that things like the amphibians are particularly high. The other implication of this is, of course, disease. We are now in the midst of a global pandemic. And actually, the main reason why the EU bird ban was finally brought through was because people said that there was a high risk of disease. But it doesn't seem to have been considered that the global amphibian trade is also a risk of disease. Ranavirus, chytrid fungus, and other diseases, including more recently a salamander chytrid, are known to be moving with these animals. They can also move with fish. And that we know that they are causing the extinction of numerous species in the wild. Unless we have both good regulations and clear biosafety standards, we are likely to impair the future survival of many of these species. So we obviously need new tools to modernize trade to ensure that these species are effectively protected. And we also need to realize that there is very high mortality for many of these species during transport. Some estimates show that over 60% of individuals of reptiles will often die in shipments, meaning that for those species accounted for on arrival, many of them may not be accounted for because they've already been disposed of as they're dead. Enabling any species to be legally traded until someone decides to CITES list it is going to leave major gaps for species like this beautiful Certodactylus. You noticed on the poster, it was actually a species that we found in Myanmar. We sent the photo and the location to someone who works on these species, and it was described last year. Thankfully, this species is not in trade yet. I would not be surprised if it is in trade soon, though, because you can see it's a very attractive gecko, and like the other Certodactylus, it is vulnerable to trade. Fish, of course, are also subject to global trade. The ornamental fish trade includes more than 125 countries globally and is worth up to 30 billion a year. Though 90% are freshwater and mostly captive bred, this has been a rapidly evolving market. There are currently over 1 billion fish traded internationally every year, and as I said earlier, up to 95% of marine fish are wild caught. This year probably is proved to be a particularly big year for developing a new cool saltwater aquarium. But we need to consider the impacts on species health, given that many of these individuals are coming from the wild. And 70% of species coming into Europe were not actually assessed. So this is very significant. So how are we faring? CITES is a trade convention. What many people fail to realize is it's basically, in the views of many people, set to maximize profits from the sustainable trade of valuable species in the long run. And this means that species that are less valuable and traded in smaller quantities are often entirely ignored. And sustainable livelihood is often put up as a reason for this. But if it's sustainable, it needs to have a baseline. If we don't have a baseline for how many species can actually be collected, then ultimately they are not going to get long-term access to this resource. Sustainability benefits everyone. And for that, we need to have a baseline of what the population of these species look like. So this is from Facebook. This is Mega Kylie Pluto. It is the largest bee in the world. And we can see that online in groups like on Facebook, they are regularly for sale. I've actually talked to people who were at the CITES convention representing Indonesia. And I've said, well, are you going to uplist this species? It's only known from one island. And they say, oh, it's sustainable livelihoods. They're using it to protect the area. And I said, have there been any population assessments? And they just looked at me blankly. Because for the majority of these species, even though we know that it is unlikely to be sustainable, we are not investing in trying to make it sustainable by developing any form of baseline to ensure that we can make sure that it is. The trade bans in Europe took years to implement because many conservationists said that they were also a violation of access and benefit sharing. And this is a very challenging balance to strike between ensuring that local populations have access to resources without driving these species to extinction. CITES also has a huge focus on African species. And if you attend a CITES COP meeting, you will find that the dialogue is dominated by Africa, whereas other parts of the world, which include many endangered species in trade, is often fairly silent. So I don't think I heard many Asian voices, and you can see this reflected in the number of listed species in many of these groups. We also need to revisit our view of CITES. It is stated to be a trade convention. Its prime focus and aim is to sustainably regulate the supply of these high-value items or species that were already recognized to be in high demand, like orchids. However, it has not adapted to a changing, more connected global market. And in the last CITES meeting, the request to uplist the Asian songbirds and tropical marine fish were both dismissed as too expensive. And this is real. We cannot expect customs officers to recognize species. And as I'll say more on in a moment, there are huge numbers of issues with CITES in the way it is currently run. And the cost is going to be very high when you do it as a species by species list as to what you cannot trade, and those species need to be recognized. If you flip it round to list species that can be traded, you can actually have a much smaller list. And there are other mechanisms that can be used to verify species identity. So we don't rely on a customs officer in a rural part of Indonesia to identify one gecko versus another. So LEMIS is the best known database in the world. And yet, if you try to look to see the number of tropical fish species that are being traded, it won't have species, it will say tropical fish. If you want to look at the butterflies, unless they are CITES listed, like the bird wings, it will say Lepidoptera. And if you are lucky, then your species might be something that has a pathogen, because if it has a pathogen, we're worried about it. So the traces database for Europe actually provides more high resolution data on what is being traded because it's a risk of pathogen spread. The World Customs Organization has also had requests for over 7 years to provide better regulations and labels for groups like the amphibians, because unless these species have a listing, it is impossible to monitor them on a global basis. And despite this pushing for better inclusion, you cannot even get quantitative data on how many tons of amphibians are being imported into areas like Europe unless they're CITES listed. As I've said already, CITES also has very uneven coverage. There are 9% of reptiles and 2.5% of amphibians that actually have a CITES listing. And this is even lower for groups like the invertebrates and not very high for things like the tropical fish. Orchids are the most covered group, but if someone were to suggest today to uplist that number of species, you can almost guarantee that the CITES bodies would vote against it because the cost would be stated to be too high. So for these highly diverse groups exported in large volumes, it is almost impossible to get any overarching protection unless we revisit the current system. And the system within CITES also means that some of the most diverse countries that should be uplisting species have no justification of actually wanting to. And the process is not one that does it on the basis of endangerment, despite endangerment actually being in the name of the convention. I've already said that. We also see that the CITES analysis is majorly flawed. Much of it is biased, and because many of the global analyses that purport to be a global analysis of trade, they also include species with a zero quota which are not in trade. That is why they were listed by CITES. There is also the assumption that the majority of species traded are traded illegally, when we found less than 0.01% were actually from seizures. As I've said, most groups are listed on a species level, and only a few, like within the tarantulas, are actually listed at higher levels. And so CITES is very expensive to operate. It also means if you have a mixed shipment of animals, it is down to customs regulators to try to identify if any of them might be CITES listed, meaning that laundering is incredibly easy for many of these groups because it might be hard to smuggle an elephant unless it's a small piece of ivory. But it is very easy to mix up species of, say, lizards, meaning that actually this may be an underestimate of the number of endangered lizard species in trade. So CITES can only work for a limited subset of species, like elephants or tigers. But does it even work for them? So this is some analysis put together by a couple of NGOs in Australia that have actually been campaigning for a long time to change the way that we trade wildlife. We can see that on average, CITES regulated trade is worth up to 320 billion annually, but their core budget is 6 million. So with 6 million, they are meant to regulate 320 billion. We also still rely on paper permits, despite the fact that e-permitting, so electronic permits, have already been given approval, but they've only so far been rolled out in Sri Lanka. The numbers do not add up. The permits are not publicly accessible or visible, and submissions may never be checked. And e-permits have not been implemented because that 6 million of annual funding is not enough to implement them. If we look at these problems, we can also see that almost every taxa and trade we look at has discrepancies. Discrepancies that are in the thousands or the tens of thousands. Species that are said to be coming from captivity where we have no evidence of captive breeding. And actually a few years ago, Indonesia was winning certificates for being able to breed in captivity all these animals that were very hard to breed. But these animal farms were moving every few years. And when people then did assessments on the ground, they found that almost all of those areas had very few wild animals of those amphibian groups left, because actually they were being collected from the wild. There can even be discrepancies of tens of thousands or tens of thousands going missing. And if we are to look quantitatively at the records from CITES, under 10% had no discrepancies, and this has increased over time. So we've already seen that for the majority of species, they're not covered by CITES, despite the fact that we are still using CITES to monitor what we think is the global trade. And yet only under 10% of those records within CITES are actually free of discrepancies. So it's clear that the system needs to change. CITES is currently failing to serve both the species it's meant to protect and those that it's currently overlooking. And a new system is urgently needed, given that we know these species are being unsustainably exploited at the moment. COVID has highlighted just how badly we need a better system of regulation. And one option could be to ban wildlife trade from the wild, except under certain circumstances. Many conservationists have also pushed against outright bans, often stating it will drive trade underground. And whilst this is true for high value items, there is not that much evidence that for lower value items, it would increase trade to a higher volume than now, especially if it was legislated in a sensible way. And as I said earlier, the EU bird ban reduced global trade of birds by 90%. It was replaced by captive breeding, which from a disease perspective, an invasive species perspective, and a sustainability perspective is obviously better for biodiversity. People often argue that bans create this black market, but there is not clear evidence for this in terms of the pet trade. And actually, if we look at access and benefit sharing, we could create systems that both protect species and the people who live in these areas. Reverse listing was first proposed by Australia in 1985, but at that time it was deemed unnecessary. The majority of species being traded in high levels were covered, and it was not envisaged we would be trading species in the volumes we are now. And it's time to revisit the system, as the current system, especially based on paper permits, clearly doesn't work. And while some conservationists, and I know that those listening will also have mixed feelings, I think everyone listening here will see that the current system doesn't work. And even having plants and animals in a system together may not be the most sensible approach, because for a plant, it's easy to send seeds. For an animal, it is much more difficult. And so thinking of a more nuanced approach that provides better protection for species, lower disease risk, and also maintains livelihoods is important. One such approach will be one that was primarily reliant on captive breeding, and only species that have been assessed and could then be validated in centralized centers based on DNA barcoding could then be exported. Such a system would provide money to the host country, because then it could be secured. You could have designated centers to do this and then exported based on these secured systems. Such a system would reduce the risk of disease, protect species, and prevent the majority of laundering. And whilst there may be some levels of illegal trade, it is unlikely to surpass the current levels of trade. Also, if farms and improved facilities can be set up, especially for species that are being exported in high values, there are other ways such as isotopic checks that can be used to ensure these species are not coming from the wild. And those kinds of facilities can also provide benefits to local populations that doesn't involve unsustainable trade of wild collected individuals. And so it can provide additional data, additional revenue, and provide a much lower level of risk. As I said prior, disease was the primary reason behind the bird trade, and we need to think about how we can implement this for other species. Mortality is high, and that can also mean that even disposing of bodies of those animals that do not survive the journey from one place to another also provides a biohazard, as well as the spread of viruses. So this year was meant to be last year, 2020 was meant to be a super year for biodiversity. We all realized that it was not so super. We managed to see a global pandemic which has touched every single one of our lives. But if we look at the species here, these CITES listed species, you'll see some of them are actually listed multiple times, like this whale shark here. Whereas we see an underrepresentation of groups that are being targeted, for example, for the pet trade. And we need to think more holistically about what is driving trade and how sustainable it is, because this year wasn't such a super year for biodiversity. And if we want the future to be better, we need to be better governors of ecosystem health. This will involve a greater synergy between these different UN conventions. Within the IUCN and CITES, they even have different boards for naming species. And unless we unify these boards, it becomes very difficult to give species protection. And at a very minimum, species that are already known to be endangered should have global regulation on their trade. The business as usual scenarios will starve us of seafood by the estimated 2048. And for many of these species, we may not know they have gone extinct in the wild because there is not sufficient data on their populations and distributions to actually understand that. And the default of exploiting until someone decides to uplist a species is costing us species and violates the precautionary principle. We also know that there are areas with higher endemism that are being exploited commercially, and most of those have no basic protection. So we need better mechanisms to develop priorities. As I said earlier, with our reptile assessment, we have had at least one moderate success, possibly. A month and a half after we published our paper and recommended the uplisting of the Goniosaurus by flagging their level of threat, Japan listed all 6 of its species of Goniosaurus, which we know to be vulnerable to trade. But we cannot have an approach where we wait until we know that these species are already highly threatened to start doing something about it and rely on local level expertise to try to prevent them being traded. And we also managed to get that through to some of the biggest markets in the world, because of course, telling people that that reptile they just bought may have come from the wild may change their choice of buying that reptile. And that species of chameleon you saw on the very first slide of this talk is actually a species that is often traded from the wild in Africa and is popular in the pet trade. So we need to revisit trade. We obviously need a different approach because our current one is driving extinction. Reverse listing is a priority with mechanisms to make sure that these systems are secure and also support captive breeding with mechanisms to ensure it is not providing an avenue for laundering. Sensible systems of certification and tracking will help us do this. And the technology exists to do it. In addition, we can't exist in 2020 where we still have no global level databases for monitoring trade. We need to make sure that all imported wildlife is in centralized databases, so we no longer have no idea what species and in what volumes they're being traded. Like all livestock, we need to make sure we're monitoring this and stop treating biodiversity as the extra, because it means that conservation will continue to fail the majority of species and the majority of systems, especially for smaller bodied species like the reptiles, which are frequently overlooked. So with that, I'd like to thank my fantastic research group, as well as Colin Strine and Ben Marshall, who worked on a lot of this analysis with me. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much, Alice. Great, that was an amazing overview, both of the pet trade and also just the functionality of CITES. So I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. Just feel free to pop your questions into the chat, and I'll relay them over. Feel free to switch on your cameras now as well if you like to. It's quite nice to again have a live audience. Okay, but I'll just kick off on one of the points you made towards the end, Alice, about influence. I know this is an eye-opener to me, and one of the things I hadn't realised is that, say, for example, Germany is so dominant in the reptile pet trade, and how much scope is there of changing cultural awareness practices around this? As you said, and a lot of this may be occurring in ignorance of the conservation impacts that are occurring there.
So it's a really good point, and it has two answers. I think the majority of people who want to have a cool reptile pet would probably not want it to come from the wild, because most people who think these animals are cool aren't going to want to lead to their extinction. If they're breeding reptiles, they also don't want to be importing a wild species that could be bringing diseases or parasites into their stock, because of course that could be vastly damaging. But then there's also a small proportion who are really looking for those novel species. Those are the people who are more likely to try to bend laws to get those species, but they are likely to be a small minority. So if more people are informed of where these animals are coming from, and there is more of a legal requirement for actually proving that they are captive bred, I think that the market dynamics could change a huge amount. Because many people here probably have or do have pet reptiles. And I don't think any of us would ever have considered that that animal may have actually come from the wild, because it's just not something we are cognizant of in this day and age. And as I said, 75% of those lizards almost were coming direct from the wild. And the ones that aren't are going to be the common ones in trade, like the leopard geckos. So if you got a leopard gecko or something, it was probably captive bred. But if it's anything that is a bit more colorful or different, there is a high chance that it came from wild. And actually for groups like the chameleons, which have a really high mortality rate because of funguses and diseases, a lot of those are still coming from the wild. And it may be one of the reasons behind why they're often not surviving more than a year in captivity.
It seems like there may be real scope for public awareness campaigns there as well.
Absolutely. I think it would be really important. It's better for everyone as well as the survival of these species.
Okay, Shyam, you had a comment or a question you had. So you're muted.
Yeah, it is indeed a very nice talk. I never thought about the other side of these legal trades. We always thought about the illegal trade. So my question is here, nowadays we, as a citizen science, as a hobbyist, we use an iNaturalist to identify the species, and then a lot of these geckos are identified through the iNaturalist platform. And this iNaturalist platform giving a real time and then GPS locations, all things. And is it going to increase this so-called legal, illegal trading? What's your take on that?
So it's a really good question. I would say that the best way to prevent that would be the same method you'd use for any endangered species that might be subject to trade, to have a few moderators who are going through iNaturalist, who would then remove the coordinates of any species that could be vulnerable to trade. Because obviously people want to share these photos, but we don't want it to make those species vulnerable. So having mechanisms that for species that might be exploited can mark that and mask that information would solve that potential problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Dan, you have a question? Dan, are you there? I can't see. Return, if you could reappear, we'll return to you. So Christopher, you have a question.
Yes, Alice, I want to thank you for a fantastic presentation. I've been in my past career involved in CITES and attending CITES meetings and always coming away fairly depressed, to say the least. And, you know, the idea you talked about, the original Australian idea of reverse listing, you know, I think those of us that have worked in CITES a bit have frequently talked about that. And I think the situation now is even more dire than it was in those past years, as you've so elegantly documented. Realistically, what are your thoughts about the future of CITES? You think CITES, which we all know in many ways is also a very corrupt organization, is the future ultimately to recognize that and to try for a whole new convention that focuses on conservation rather than actually promoting trade? Or do you think that CITES can actually be revived into an effective organization and implement something like reverse listing?
So it's a fantastic question. Obviously, it's not an easy one to give an answer to. I know from John Scanlon and others, they say that they are going to try to renovate CITES. To me, the prime reason for an approach like that is because it would be difficult to get all of those signatories today and to actually get countries to agree to it. However, as you said, I was depressed by CITES and I was very unimpressed attending those meetings because it is a trade convention and it is not targeting the effective conservation of the majority of species. I think that we have a very difficult decision because renovating CITES at this point would require totally changing the system. And there are likely to be some of the major supporters of CITES that would not want to see such a move. So it would require support from those especially in the African continent that might push very hard against it. What may be more acceptable to them, given that the species that are already CITES listed would be covered by a reverse listing approach, then it would just have that quota, or it would still be untradeable because it's zero quota. So it may probably be easier to work with that convention if you could get those bodies on board, because negotiating a convention that also had 185 countries on board in 2020 would be very challenging. However, our conventions have not done very well. The Montreal Protocol is the only global protocol that's actually been entirely effective. And so unless we have additional mechanisms like actually sanctioning countries that are not following through with agreements, it's going to be very difficult to actually do a lot of this. And so implementing it, I think, would require either a huge change within CITES, as you say, challenging, especially given corruption issues, but it may be simpler than trying to start from scratch when a lot of countries, unless you had several very powerful countries, would just decide not to get involved.
Yeah, Christopher, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are about.
Yeah.
I think for those of us that have, as I say, had the dubious pleasure of attending CITES meetings, it is a question that, you know, for years we've all been asking ourselves, and I've gone back and forth in my own mind about, you know, whether it's possible to scrap the whole thing and do a new convention, which, as Alice says, is incredibly difficult. But I'm just wondering, with the new global realization that seems to be emerging about both climate change and biodiversity loss as sort of existential threats, whether a window might possibly open to do something like that. I agree with Alice, having been at those meetings, to actually change those very well entrenched views, and many of which are dubiously funded views. I think would be extraordinarily challenging. But if CITES goes along as it is at the moment, I think in another 20 years' time, we'll still be talking about a gross failure with more biodiversity loss. So it's a huge conundrum for conservation, I think.
Yeah. Okay, I think Dan's fixed his question. Actually, before I ask Dan, I'd be curious to see if anybody in the audience has any thoughts on the proposition of the effectiveness of trade trade bans and complete bans, and that. So if anybody has any particular perspective or question on that, feel free to pipe up. But I'll over to Dan now.
Thanks, Shavinder. Yeah, it's Dan Challender from Zoology. Thanks for the talk, Alice. It was very, very interesting. For both reptiles and amphibians, you discussed online trade and inferred to some extent that trade equals threat. Now, for me, for some species, trade could be a problem, but for others, it might not be. So surely what's needed now is actually more research to determine the case before stating categorically, i.e. assuming that trade is a problem for all these species, especially where it's linked to local livelihoods and local economies.
Yep, I completely agree with you. So as I said, about on average, 44% of individuals were coming from the wild and up to about 75% for the lizards. We know in some cases those are critically endangered or range restricted species. What I think is that in order to trade a species, we need to have some form of baseline to make sure that that trade is sustainable and it has a quota. So that's one reason I think that a reverse listing approach is actually sensible, because then you can have a group or a population saying, we want to export this species, and then you get the data to ensure that it is sustainable. Yeah. There are going to be many cases when it is sustainable to export that species. I think the current quota for tokay gecko export from Indonesia is about 3.3 million individuals. So how sustainable that is up for discussion. But I think, as you say, if we have more data, we can make informed approaches. But what I don't think we can afford to do is to assume everything is sustainable until someone realizes that the species is on the brink of extinction. And that is the situation we are in at the moment. So I think a captive-driven trade or a trade based on these sustainability assessments is something we need to move towards. And then we need to have a system that actually ensures that it is not being used to facilitate laundering. And there are ways that that could be done, but it would require a reconsideration of global wildlife trade exports, etc. So local customs centers doing these local checks, providing certification, etc. And in that case, it could be done sustainably. But for the majority of species, given that we know that many of the species that are coming from the wild are endangered, it is likely to cause a severe problem in terms of the long-term survival of those species.
Just as a quick follow-up, do you think that the threshold might be set too high to ensure that that trade is sustainable? I think about some of the species that are traded from Indonesia and where, you know, they're managed in terms of traditional ecological knowledge. You know, there could be cases where actually that trade is sustainable, and if you went to a reverse listing system, the threshold would be set too high, and those markets would be closed off immediately. I think about the python trade in CITES, and the EU keeps raising the bar for python trade to be sustainable. And I work with people that work in that industry, and you know, they're pretty clear that it is sustainable, but the EU keeps closing off the market. So, you know, with a reverse listing, you know, you could change the entire system and cut off lots of markets to local people and local economies.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why it's always hard to strike this balance. And I think then you develop systems that actually find ways of verifying it, because often the West thinks it knows best. And often, as you say, local knowledge can actually be very useful. So making sure you have standard ways in place to actually work out what the capacity is for export and ensure that it is sustainable. Because there are going to be cases both ways, and it's difficult to strike that compromise. But we also need to move away from a system where the EU always knows best. It's often not the case. And actually making this a more democratic system may also help inclusion and make sure that species that are currently being traded unsustainably get better coverage within these types of approaches.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions? Feel free to just pipe up if you didn't put anything in the chat. No, I think that's it. So we're approaching an hour and a half, so it's probably a good time to wrap up. So thank you once again, Alice. It must be at 1:30 in the morning in China, I'm guessing now. So particularly thank you for being so alert and powerful in your analysis and presentation at that time in the morning. And personally, that was a real eye-opener to me. As has been said, I wasn't aware of the issues around the legal trade in wildlife at all until seeing this.
It's a pleasure. And if anyone has further questions, feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy to discuss things further when people have had time to think over these ideas more.
Okay, great. And as I mentioned, this is recorded and it'll be popping up onto our YouTube channel probably later this evening. And so feel free to circulate it around any other people you think might be interested in hearing. Okay, thank you very much. I also welcome everyone to switch on your mics at least and give us a real round of applause. And
thank you for hosting, and thank you all for staying with me, even if it's a little less late there.
Okay, great. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.